Just wait a second for it to configure.
Oh, I see it's uploading. Yeah.
I think we're live. Let me just double check. Yeah, cool. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Download with Joe. We didn't do one last week. I was on holiday, so hopefully none of you missed the conversation too much. But we're back with a really interesting topic today, and it follows on from the one that we did a couple of weeks ago around M&A. With these episodes, we want to try and keep them as concise as possible, and ultimately, time is against us because we don't want to share so much within an hour. We want to try and do it within 20 to 30 minutes. But for the M&A topic we had last week, or the week before, sorry, there were certain areas that we didn't cover, and we'll go through that. And it's going to be predominantly focused around how PE, private equity, continues to roll up certain types of businesses within our ecosystem. We can share more in due course, but first of all, my name is Lewis. I'm the founder of LMC, which is a recruitment business specializing specifically in the smart buildings and climate tech space. Joe, welcome back. Quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah. Thanks, Lewis. It's good to see you again. I know you're on a trip, so you look very well rested. Joe Amador, and I run Amador Consulting. We're fractional head of product capabilities and services for technology or tech-enabled firms that are touching the decarbonization or digitization of commercial real estate. So a lot of product background. There's also a fair bit of work we do with investors, commercial due diligence, market scouting, market sizing, and that is the other side of the business, if you will. Strong relationships with owners and operators. So also just have a really good ear to the ground of what are the trends, what are people investing in, what's catching the eye of a typical owner or operator, head of facilities, head of sustainability at a big commercial real estate firm.
Nice. We'll talk about your newsletter perhaps towards the end, but the latest
Sure.
one's out now, I believe.
Yeah, we do every Sunday evening the first of the month Sunday every evening. So that was the 4th of August. So yeah, came out.
Nice. So a couple of weeks ago, and even before that, we cover and have covered tech solutions or tech-based services to buildings, how either it's products, partnerships, or M&A focused around that. But even when I joined the space back in 2017, one of the key themes, which continues to be a trend, is that there is a long channel of value of providers of, let's say, we can build a fixer, we can build a chiller, or we can provide a truck-based service to businesses or to buildings and fix it. And there's a ton of interest within private equity around that. And like I said at the start, them rolling up those specific businesses globally, but most definitely across the US. And there's a ton that we can go into, and quite a few really strong case studies. So yeah, Joe, where do you want to start? Do you want to give a quick introduction in terms of what's happening here, and we can go from there?
Yeah. And maybe a good place to start very high level is there's a couple slides from a good report from the Bonneville Power Authority that kind of highlight how the market is structured. And in the newsletter I published this past week, I talked a lot about, and we might touch on it later, the JCI Bosch transaction. We talked about that, of course, 2 weeks ago. There's a lot of dynamics in how HVAC, and to some degree controls as well, but HVAC is maybe more of the focus for private equity firms. How those products actually go from there's a factory building a rooftop unit, for example, and then there's a person who is putting the rooftop unit on the roof. So let me share my screen real quick and just very high level, I'll talk about this. Let me just share. And so this is that report, and it's public. It's from 2016. So the data in here is 8 years old, but the actual news, information, content kind of framework is not. So high level, there's two things I wanted to show here. One, how does this what is the supply chain, or you could even say the value chain in terms of all these different players? You have the manufacturers. Those are the names that you see on the chillers, on the HVAC: York, Carrier, Trane, Daikin, Lennox in some cases. There's others, of course. So there's differences in how this gets to the building, if it's a residential building, your home, my home, or commercial buildings. High level, I'll talk about this for a second, and then I'll move to one that's more detailed. But you have what is typically called two-step distribution. Manufacturers are selling to distributors. The distributors are pretty regional, right? Like large city, large multi-state area, there are multiple distributors. They have relationships with the OEMs. They're buying equipment. They're holding it in a warehouse. And then the contractors or builders, if it's a new construction, they are buying from the distributor. So when you call at your house, if you call an HVAC firm to come and just do maintenance, to check things out, to fix something, you're typically calling somebody here. They will have a relationship with a distributor. And these firms, even if they aren't overtly stating it, they're typically working with a specific OEM or a few OEMs, but not all of the OEMs. So this is broken down. You could say for any individual region, I live in the Denver area, London's much bigger, but it's going to work pretty similarly. You will have multiple distributors. Some of them will carry the Carrier line. Some will carry the Trane line. Some will carry the York line. And then below them are contractors that are working with one of them. So that's two-step distribution. Now, when you get into commercial, things get a little bit more complicated. One, the manufacturer's representatives are absolutely influencing, selling to, marketing to, building relationships with the contractors. And I would argue they're also, in some cases, building relationships directly with the commercial building owners and operators, head of facilities, head of sustainability. But this is generally how things work. And there are entities, firms at all of these levels. And as you get down to distributors and especially down to contractors and builders, these become interesting roll-up targets for private equity firms. Now, if we move really quickly, there's one other thing to show. This is one of those two-page, it's a PDF booklet that is digital. So this is one half of it. I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to go back to the other side. This is for over 25 tons in terms of cooling capacity, right? So like a rooftop unit, 5, 8, 10 tons. So this is small chiller up to very large chiller. And you can see the value chain or the distribution. You have the manufacturer, same as before. They are making in factories chillers, rooftop units, heat pump chillers. So there's a lot of product being constructed or built, and they're typically going to an HVAC contractor directly. And in a lot of cases, they own that contractor. Not always. So JCI has 120 or so branches in the United States. They are the contractor. They are going to buildings, and they are part of the JCI entity. In other cases, it could be a franchisee. There are definitely some independents here. So an independent firm that acts as the HVAC contractor that has a relationship with an OEM, but it's more common for the actual OEM to own the entire distribution supply chain. There are manufacturers' representatives. They're helping really more for new construction is typically where I see this, where they're helping you spec it out, pick what do we want. That could be a mechanical contractor. That could be slightly different, just more of an influencer. But there's that. When we go back and look at smaller, so under 25 tons, unitary equipment, this is typically going to be the unitary equipment. You can see there's multiple steps. So again, we get back to this two-step distribution. Distributors, branches, HVAC contractors. These are independent entities. Distributors, these are independent entities, HVAC contractors. Now again, the OEMs can go direct, right? If you're think of who is a large entity using unitary equipment. Grocery stores, restaurants, retail, bank branches, they may go directly to the OEM. They may have there might be a national accounts team at the OEM that sells direct, but there's still a lot of product being moved through this two-step independent group or these groups. And these HVAC contractors, there are roll-ups taking place. So I'm going to stop there just to show you, but this is where, and even at the distributor level to some degree, this is where these PE roll-ups are playing. What you're seeing is kind of a very formulaic model of we're going to go buy an entity that has maybe one branch, maybe two branches, maybe 5 branches in a region. Could be all the cities in the Southeast, like South Carolina, North Carolina. There's a number of big enough cities, could be up to into Georgia, up to Virginia. But then the strategy is, let's go buy more of these and build a bigger and bigger and bigger entity. And then at some point, those will be sold. Last thing I'll say, if you're really interested in this, there are definitely private equity firms that are backing platforms to do this. There's some public entities, some public firms that this is also their strategy, and that's a little bit more transparent because they have to report every quarter and they have kind of documents about strategy. And there's a lot of debate in the industry of just, is this the right model? Is this not the right model? And then you have still branches owned by the big OEMs, and they've all been talking about in their financials, we want to spend more time and gain more market share on the life cycle services, right? So that's, we sell you the equipment. There's really not a lot of competition outside of those OEMs to build, chillers. Like, there's not a lot of companies coming into the market saying, we're going to start building chillers. It's when you get the chiller into the building and you maintain the chiller, that's where everyone wants to gain more market share. So there's a number of different types of firms. They're not all doing a roll-up, but the roll-up is touching all of them.
Okay, and you mentioned something interesting which I didn't think of when we was doing this planning, but there's direct and indirect. So what's the difference between both? Because we can obviously talk about, off the top of my head, probably 4 really strong case studies of companies or organizations doing these roll-ups. What's the difference?
Yeah. And I've seen, I don't have a great list. At some point, I'll probably pull together a list, and in the newsletter, we'll actually share it and say, here's the list of PE-backed roll-ups. So direct versus indirect. These are the terms that when I worked at JCI, we talked about them as direct versus indirect. I'll generally explain them. So direct is when, really, especially for those bigger commercial buildings, the relationship from end to end is, in terms of the sales relationship and the delivery and the service relationship, is the OEM itself doing it directly. So JCI in the US is the best example because they have the strongest branch network in America. They're not the only ones with a strong branch network, but I think they have the most branches, or among the most. So that means let's kind of reverse it. I'm a building owner, or I'm just the head of facilities, the folks that we always spend time with at Realcomm and all the other great events. They might call their JCI rep directly for HVAC service. They might say, I've talked to chief engineers, heads of facilities who say, I have York chillers, I have a York maintenance contract with York, and I'm now upgrading and adding some data-driven services around that because it's all with York, which is JCI. They would use those terms interchangeably at this point. Direct in that JCI is kind of the only entity servicing that relationship from end to end. Indirect is when there's a local or regional entity that can do the exact same type of service. Maybe it's not as data-driven because they don't have the same resources to build their own tech, but maybe they're using some third-party tech capabilities and platforms, and they're the ones getting the phone call to say, I think I have an issue with my rooftop units or with my chiller. I don't know what's wrong. Here's some interesting things I'm seeing on my side in my terminal. Temperatures are not being met. It seems to be happening more in the afternoon. There's things you could kind of identify without knowing what is the problem. You would call that entity. They would come. They would do all the service. They would bill you for the service. If you actually needed a new part, they do not make parts. They would go maybe to the distributor to buy the parts. So indirect is really a better way of saying there's multiple entities that are servicing you along that supply chain. The last thing I'll say, it's not black or white, right? Like that graphic I showed earlier where it was over 25 tons, under 25 tons, that is generally true. There's all kinds of examples of, for our rooftop units that are 5, 8, maybe 10 tons, think of any HVAC OEM directly. Maybe they have a good relationship. In other cases, they might go to all of them and say, hey, we need another 100 rooftops this coming year because our capital plan says they're all too old. And they might say, and they might ask all of them, bid directly, what's the best price you can give us for the 100 rooftops? So it's not black or white in that everything goes this way or that way. Generally, that's how the market works. But because it's not 100% black or white, there's a lot of cases where firms or private equity firms in particular are saying, hey, there's an opportunity here. So, to kind of add another dimension, you definitely have the most number of private equity roll-ups happening for HVAC. HVAC is just a pretty easy type of service to roll up. We can talk about that. You see it a little bit with controls. I see it a little bit with fire, life safety. I see it a little bit with access control and security. They all have the same dynamic. There's an OEM, there's probably distributors, there's probably local integrators, installers. Can we go find those local integrators, installers, and pull them all together into a roll-up? And then there's the public companies like MCOR, EMCOR, and Comfort Systems are two good examples of public companies that actually do this as well. They will go out and buy entities. And even the OEMs will buy some of these independent entities. Usually they already have a relationship. They're already a big installer of that equipment anyway. But they're also beefing up the channel. So the roll-up is not only PE-backed, it's just that's where you see the most players and the most platforms.
Why would you say that? And again, just from what I've seen within HVAC in particular, that it's more prominent in terms of seeing these roll-ups. Is there a specific reason why? Is there a better business case for it, or is it easier to do?
Yeah, it's generally easy, and it's kind of I wouldn't say the business case is necessarily better. I mean, you could argue HVAC will have a lot of maintenance required. If you look at like HVAC systems versus lighting systems, lighting just doesn't need as much maintenance, right? So there's just less things you're going to call your lighting contractor to say, hey, my lights don't work. Changing light bulbs can be pretty easy. Anyway, HVAC is uniquely interesting because the HVAC systems are generally the same. I mean, obviously, Trane is building its rooftops in its factory. Carrier is building its rooftops in its factory, but they're very similar, right? They have compressors. The compressors are potentially both from Copeland, which was part of Emerson. The refrigerants, you can select different refrigerants, but at the end of the day, it's kind of like a car in that it has the same piece of equipment. If I take my car to a different dealer, they're not going to say, hey, I don't know what's going on. I can't help you. I mean, you would only see it if it's like you have an electric car and you try to take it to a shop and say, hey, you don't need an oil change, sir. You have an electric car. But in HVAC, so anyone can maintain, and there's no proprietary protocols touching this to say, well, we can't tell you what kind of compressor this is because we can't access the data. Like you could just look at the compressor and say, hey, there's an issue. We need to replace your compressor. On the control side, it's very different, right? The configuration software that you would use to set up, maintain, look at the points, diagnose problems, to have access to that config software, you have to be a contractor that is working with that OEM. So there's a bit of a lock-in dynamic there where if we work a lot with Honeywell and we go to a building that has a JCI control system, you could kind of reprogram everything, but the time required to do that is prohibitive, to be frank, right? No one's going to do that just to figure out like there's an issue, people are uncomfortable in this room. So you end up kind of being locked in to say, I can only go get service from somebody who has access to the config software, the other side of the building automation system that the service providers have. And so there are roll-ups, but even in those roll-ups, they might have a branch here, a branch there, some Honeywell branches, some Siemens branches, some Schneider branches. They can't really bundle things in the way that you would normally think of bundling them because the people in those locations really can only sell and service Schneider or Siemens or Honeywell or there's 8 or 9 kind of significant controls products. So that's the reason why HVAC is easier. There's more centralization, streamlining you can do. Whereas at the end of the day, it's unlikely that if you bought one controls branch of all 4 of the big 4, you would say, let's move everyone to Siemens, because you have all these buildings that they're not going to just rip out and replace the JCI system for Siemens unless it gets to kind of like that time in the life cycle. And you also probably are one of 2 or 3. The other thing is, in all cases, it's rare to find a huge number of service providers at that integrator level working with each OEM. They kind of limit how many preferred suppliers or integrators are there here regionally. And that kind of helps everyone, right? You have some integrators where you can say, look, you're one of 3 in this region. There's a lot of business for you. So you have no incentive to say bye to us and go to find a different OEM. And that other OEM probably has their own 2 or 3 preferred providers, and they probably don't want to leave. So there's a bit of stasis in that side of the market, but that's why controls are much more difficult.
So these, from a control standpoint then, because I think this is quite a nice segue to revert back to something we didn't have time to speak about last week, or the week before, sorry, which is Bosch's acquisition, what, 10, 12 years ago with Climatech?
Yeah,
That seems to be one of the
2013,
most
I think.
successful
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. So actually, climate tech is another. I mean, when you look at the service providers, integrators, they might do new construction, they might do existing buildings, they might do both. They might focus on types of buildings, they might focus on types of the market, commercial, industrial, or institutional, industrial. There's just a lot of companies. I mean, even I haven't really mapped that out fully, but there's a lot of firms I could put into buckets there. So Climatech was acquired by Bosch 2013, 2014. So it was about 10 years ago. And they're also a successful delivery firm. Like they're delivering equipment. These firms also can come back and say, you don't need a new control system. You don't need new HVAC, but hey, we can finance some upgrades, or we can, you're building a new building. We can help you with that. What's most interesting about that is if you look at what a HVAC company has, they typically have the services arm, they have their own trucks, and you see them driving on the street, and they make their own equipment. Bosch only had the services arm. They do make HVAC equipment, but it was harder to find, right? Like if I called a HVAC contractor for my house, they might carry some equipment from Bosch, but they would say, hey, we do a lot more American Standard, which is a Trane brand. We do a lot more Bryant, which is a Carrier brand. But if you really want a Bosch piece of equipment, sure, we can sell that to you. Now they have kind of a strong entity on both sides. They make, York's light commercial was not nearly as
Yeah.
strong from a market size as Trane or Carrier, but it was still a significant player. So one of the, I would say, probably top 5 there. And then they have the Climatech business. It will be, there were no announcements, interestingly, on we own Climatech, we own York's light commercial and residential, but there's a lot of opportunity there. And it kind of fits in with this theme, as you said.
So if we look at the likes of Albir Energy, Albir is an interesting one because
Yeah.
and if you look at their PE firm, Huron Capital, they've acquired
Yeah.
both controls businesses as well as also
Yeah.
access control and security. So
Yeah.
how does that differ from the likes of a company like MCOR? I know Comfort
Yeah.
Systems and MCOR is relatively similar, but
Yeah.
I see Comfort Systems more as like a HVAC based business, whereas MCOR have tried to round out their product or solution offering to do controls, energy
Yeah.
services, HVAC.
Yeah. So you're right to point that out. I would say that for all of these companies, the model generally is similar, right? We want to play in the delivery and maintenance of the equipment, not in the OEMing or the construction. I mean, Bosch is big enough that they're doing both, but most of the companies that are, the MCORs, the Comfort Systems, um, I don't see them saying we want to now get into the manufacture of HVAC. I mean, never say never, but that's different. But you make a good point. Huron Capital has actually backed even beyond HVAC controls building systems. They have an interesting model. They're a smaller PE firm, so oftentimes their exits are selling to a larger PE firm that will continue to scale things. They're not always, but that is one kind of traditional model for them. They've done these roll-ups in a lot of places in buildings. So Pueblo Mechanical, which is more residential focused, again,
Yep.
HVAC provider. So when you call for service at your house, they had built that up over a couple of years. They sold that, I forget to who, but that was a couple of years ago. There was a newsletter item where they have one for fire life safety, and they've been buying up businesses there. I think they're moving in based on some public emails I've received. I'm on their mailing list that they're doing now chiller service. So there are some independents that focus on chillers. I could see a business popping up here focused on data center maintenance. So that's a little different because a lot of the big hyperscalers, like they build, if you're an Amazon or an Azure, Microsoft Azure, you kind of build every data center basically identical. So there's less difference, right? So the maintenance needs are there, but you might say, hey, we know how this is going to operate because every data center, like if you look at the blueprint, it's like it's in Iowa, it's in North Carolina, it's
Yep.
in the DC metro area.
If
But
only
there's
commercial real estate was like
opportunities.
that.
Exactly. Yeah, I know, right? Like I wish like this is your top floor, and the
Yeah.
windows will be, yeah. Anyway, but so you're seeing different companies say either we think there's an opportunity to do this because right now I think if I was to actually sit down, there's probably 15 or more PE backed roll ups really focused on HVAC, and some of them are residential, some of them are residential and light commercial. It's less common to see them doing anything but like when you get to large complex buildings, there's less firms doing roll-ups there, though you could see that happening in the future. This chiller service business is certainly, focused on that Alberio, or not Alberio, but Huron is now backing. They're certainly going to look at the bigger buildings because that's where you find more chillers. But you're seeing different models pop up, right? We want to do this with a type of building. We want to do this with, to your other question, what's the difference between MCOR, Climate Tech? I think, do they focus on truck-based service? A lot of this is truck-based because you're rolling a truck to go figure out what's wrong with this HVAC equipment or what's wrong with these controllers in the control system. Do they try to build wraparound services, financing, longer-term service contracts? And there's differences there. Some of it's going to be based on what type of buildings are they working on. There are also companies that really have built up kind of mid-sized ESCOs. Same idea. We're buying up individual entities. They have knowledge, but we're maybe not changing the business model, but focusing on the business model of, would you like us to finance all of this? And that's especially useful if you're a public institution, school, university, city government, for example. Hospitals might also be attracted to that, where, yes, we actually don't have money right now to upgrade our central plant, but we know we need to. What can we do? And they say, hey, we can finance that for you. And then that is how they then deliver all these services. So there's a bunch of different models. I haven't necessarily mapped out this model works best here, or this company is really doubling down on one model versus the other. I think the fundamentals we're talking about, high level, how does everything work in the industry, getting from we build it to we put it in your building to then we maintain it, that's going to be pretty similar regardless. It's just the entities you talk to. And there's a lot of regional plays as well, right? So if you're in Texas versus California versus New York, the firms you're talking to may be very different, just based on who has better market share.
Agreed. Two final points before we look to wrap up.
Sure.
I'm going to put you on the spot here, but
it's okay.
What does, if you were a private equity firm, what are you looking for so that it fits within their thesis of buying and rolling up these companies?
So a big part of the thesis when it comes to private equity is kind of like the fundamental financial performance of the business. That's number one, right? We want, and I would say typically is there has to be some EBITDA there. So actual earnings, not just top line revenue and then losses. If you look at VC backed companies to start, they might be losing money every year. That's why they're raising money. That's probably not as attractive to private equity. I think there's typically been more of a focus on actual service, like less software based. Some of these companies absolutely have built software, but for example, if it's an infrastructure-based private equity firm, they're probably more interested in the fact that we're servicing and maintaining infrastructure versus we have a software product that is going to drive a lot of ARR. That can vary a little bit, but they're looking for bigger businesses. A few million at least of EBITDA, low tens of millions of top line revenue. And I think the other side of it is unique player, operationally sound. As you buy more of these businesses, if you're a private equity firm, you will probably figure out like which are the strong players versus the weaker players. There's also some opportunity there for back office streamlining, right? You don't need to have necessarily a billing department for every local branch anymore. You don't necessarily need a marketing team. You can kind of bring all that together. The other side that I've heard commonly, if you're the 35-year-old who's been in the business for 15 years, you're looking at where do I go? Because the person who runs the business is only 55 and he or she is not retiring anytime soon. If you become part of a bigger entity, hey, do you want to go run this other business that's, maybe it's, other side of the state, maybe it's the next state over, maybe it's other side of the country. We need somebody, what you're doing. Very similar dynamics here. The individual who runs that business is retiring. A lot of the exits you're seeing, we didn't talk about this, is it can be, I'm about to retire. I don't know who I'm going to give the business to. Oh, I'll sell it, right? Like that's my exit. And that for them can be their retirement plan, just to be, perfectly honest, or it can just be not shutting this down. We have 100 employees. We have a great name in the Atlanta, Georgia area, just to, pick a random city out. They are not going to just shut the business down, but maybe there's no one obviously in the organization that either wants to or is able to take it over. That's also where private equity can step in and say, yeah, we will pay you for that business, sir or ma'am. We would love to have that. And here's what we're doing. So those are some of the things that they're looking for. I'll be honest, when I talk to some of these firms, it's not like there's like a three check marks, but like it's always the same. But I think what I mentioned, EBITDA, stronger business, financially, and then having, there's less of a need to be differentiated, right? Like the
Yeah, I was gonna.
differentiation may just be like we're one of the two biggest sellers and distributors and servicers of the train line in Raleigh, North Carolina. I don't know why I keep picking Southeast. I guess I saw your photos from when you went on your vacation. I was just thinking about the ocean. Anyway, but
Yeah.
I think you get it.
No, I get it. And again, I've not been a part of an M&A deal, but it seems like it's a little bit cleaner, right? Like there's less nuances to get through in order to acquire these businesses. There's not really much that's
Yeah,
proprietary, so you're not judging the valuation of a
yeah,
business based on the technology. It's based on the profits.
yeah, yeah. That's true. I mean, I do much more when it comes to anything M&A related. Diligence is the most common. Helping with market scouting is another one. I do much more on the technology side, to be frank. I touch the PE backed roll ups a little bit, but not as much. It's cleaner, right? Like I can't tell you, and I'm speaking generally here, how many software businesses or firms who have looked at software businesses have contacted me, and the themes of even just like this is the market opportunity, the TAM, and the TAM's honestly, even in the past year, I could probably point to a 10x to 20x difference in what firms say their TAM is when they're largely doing the same thing. I mean, maybe the application layer is a little bit different, but it having a 20x difference in TAM tells me that I'm not calling anyone individually out, but like it's there's not that much uncertainty, right? Like it shouldn't be that big of a difference. And on the other side, you hear things like, oh, the technology is excellent. We just need a sales team to go sell it. Or we just need to beef up the sales team. And it's like, that's a little bit riskier than I have this business. These are my revenues. This is what it's looked like for the past 10 years. We're one of two entities that can service these buildings. I can tell you how many there are in our geography. I want to retire because I'm just getting ready to retire. Would you like to take over the business? Like that's much cleaner, much less uncertainty.
Agreed. So we've got about 2 minutes. One thing that I'd like to discuss, just because it was a really big acquisition, um, is the Entrosim, or Hepta Systems, as they were previously known,
Yeah.
acquisition from Wesco, which was pretty interesting because the way in which I see Wesco is more of a electrical distribution firm, and now they've got access to a smart building software
Yeah.
platform.
Yeah. And I think Wesco, so I have definitely, we'll talk Wesco, we'll talk Entrosim. I've definitely seen Wesco pop up amongst just at an event talking to an owner and says, hey, I got bids from these three firms. This is what I like. This is what I didn't like. Maybe just like an informal coffee chat. And Wesco has definitely been mentioned. They're definitely moving into, you could say, life cycle services or technology that helps them deliver life cycle services. So this is definitely an area of focus for them, without a doubt. So they buying technology assets to help do that makes sense. The other side of it is as an electrical distributor, there's a huge amount happening in data centers related to electrical distribution, right? Like how do the servers get powered? There's a lot of equipment, physical things you need in the data center. You could argue the two physical types of systems you're putting in data centers, electrical distribution. So Eaton, if you look at Eaton's stock price, for example, it's just, going through the moon. I mean, it was until a week and a half ago. And this is a large part of that. And then the other side is HVAC, right? So you see like Vertiv is a pure play, almost pure play in HVAC. And they've also kind of had that same rise. Same as like the utilities, because there's more demand for, all these picks and shovels type businesses. So Wesco is not making this stuff; they're distributing it, just as we talked about before. And as the distributor, the installer, having the relationship with the direct operator of the data center, they're saying, well, what else can we be doing here? Well, lifecycle services, software enabled capabilities, software to help augment our staff. It all makes perfect sense. And that's where Entrosim comes in. And this was really focused, the way they portrayed it, very much focused on data centers. They don't only focus on, as Entrosim, only focus on data centers. I mean, large commercial buildings, airports, universities, there's a bunch of different, but Wesco has been building up or buying a fair number of fundamental kind of technology platforms. I think there's been other other acquisitions they've done over the past couple of years, beyond this one. So that's my high level on it.
No, it's interesting feedback, and it's good news for the industry. I think they sold for what, $30 million, which
It was 30
always
million.
is,
Yeah.
which is just positive to see, because that's the kind of news and updates we need to see in the industry if we're
Yeah.
going to see other companies follow that journey.
Yeah.
Especially
Yeah.
in what's been a difficult 24 months.
Yeah, and actually, one of the things I hear so I have on my website, on the Amador Consulting website, and I share this through the newsletter. We just have a tracker of acquisitions and partnerships. We just list them all. And if you look at the M&A spreadsheet, which is just anyone can access it, if you go to our website, go to resources, it's right there. I would say like 95% of the transactions announced, there's no financials disclosed. Because if you're a big entity buying a small entity, it's not material. You don't have to disclose it. A lot of people tell me, like, man, it's great to see one where they actually have a number, because I'm trying to figure out comps. I'm trying to figure out what's the state of the market. And I get calls every once in a while, like, do you have the actual financial data for all these others? And I say, no, it wasn't disclosed. Like, when it says undisclosed, it wasn't disclosed. But having some of those comps is important. And that's actually the number one thing I hear from people in reference to it's not always, oh, great price, or, I mean, that's obviously important as well, but it's just, I'm glad I know what the price was.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's good to see what the level, or like the baseline is, or even the success rate is across the space.
Yeah.
And it's also nice to be nosy.
Yeah.
I think that's all we've got time for. But another great conversation. We'll be back again next week. I think same time, Joe. Another new theme. In the meantime, Joe, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, I think next week we'll figure out what we might talk about, partnerships or financings. We're starting to get into a bit of a cycle. But I think starting next week, we're back to Tuesdays, which is really, I think, when we plan to have these on Tuesday morning for US time, afternoon for Europe. It's just, there's been, between vacations and all the other things that happen in like July and early August, it's been hard to find a consistent time. But I think our goal is to have a consistent time and day.
That is the goal. If you'd like to check out Joe's newsletter, I'll drop a link in the comments. Like I said many times, it's one of the best, if not the best, newsletters, and he's just released August's edition.
Exactly. Lewis, always great to see you. It was a fun discussion.
Yeah, likewise. See you next week, Joe. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, see you next week. Bye.